sleet found every seam in Barbara MacDonald's mantle before she reached the Bath coaching yard, and by the time the first bell sounded for the London coach, her stockings were wet to the knee and her heels were rubbed open inside shoes, too narrow at the back. She stood near the loading platform because that was where the trunks were brought down to be tagged and auctioned for unpaid accounts, and she stood very still, because shivering in front of strangers felt like another form of begging. The wool at her shoulders had gone dark with water. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and clung to her temples and throat. A porter with red hands and a redder nose looked at her, then looked again, as if deciding whether she was servant or supplicant, then laughed toward the man beside him. "That one has come to buy silk with brass." They did not lower their voices. No one ever did for her. She pressed her gloved thumb against the coins hidden in her palm and counted without looking. 4 coppers, 1 thin shilling with a nick near the crown. Not enough for a room, not enough for warm broth. Perhaps enough, if the clerk had pity, to reclaim 1 trunk that should never have left her father's house. The trunk stood 3 yards away under the awning, damp leather clouded with rain, the brass corners greened from neglect. Her father's initials were still cut into the side in a hand she could have traced blindfolded, a M for Alistair MacDonald. She had polished those corners when she was 13 and still spoken to as if she belonged to the front stairs. The auction clerk flicked through his docket, licked his finger, and glanced up with that practised indifference men reserved for women without witnesses. "Lot 43, he said, "marked for debt transfer under Wycliffe instruction." She swallowed hunger and cold and stepped closer. "It was not hers to sell," the clerk shrugged. "Then she should not have had title papers." She did not say that title papers could be made to say whatever a household wished when no one cared to ask who benefited. She did not say that she had watched Lady Wycliffe sign her husband's name in a hand 2 strokes too heavy, and smile afterward over lavender water. She only loosened the damp leather glove and laid her coins on the desk one by one, careful not to let them slip from numb fingers. The clerk looked almost ashamed when he counted. Almost. "Half," he said. "You can settle the remainder by week's end. If not, the trunk returns to sale." She nodded because gratitude was expected from those being robbed at a discount. When she bent to lift it, pain shot up through both heels. She did not make a sound. A boy from the stables watched her struggle and moved as if to help, then stopped when the head porter called his name. No one touched the trunk but her. By 8 o'clock she was sent out again, trunk abandoned in a storage stall she could not afford to keep, ledger satchel on her shoulder, sleeves stiff with drying sleet. Lady Wycliffe had left instructions folded under the sugar bowl before sunrise, each line written with ornamental loops that turned command into decoration. "Deliver this account to Mr. Fenley by 9. Collect receipt from the draper in Abbey Green. Carry revised balances to the solicitor in Milsom Street. Do not incur coach fare." Barbara crossed the city on foot, because she always did. The pavements were slick stone. Cartwheels threw grit against her skirts. Bells from 3 churches argued over the hour while she climbed and descended streets, with the satchel striking her hip like a second heartbeat. She entered warm rooms and was not offered a chair. She waited by doors while clerks examined seals and asked, without asking, why the late Mr. MacDonald's daughter now came in person, like paid staff. At Mr. Fenley's office, the junior partner gave her a half-smile that never reached his eyes. "Lady Wycliffe keeps strict economy." Barbara held out her hand for the receipt. "Lady Wycliffe keeps strict records of candles consumed by other people." He blinked, uncertain if he had been rebuked. She dropped her gaze at once and accepted the paper before he could choose a fence. Near noon, she stood behind the stable wall off the cheap street and ate yesterday's bread hard enough to scrape her gums, while rainwater dripped from the eaves and found the back of her neck. The stableman's wife passed once with a basket and looked at her as if deciding whether to speak. She did not. Pity was expensive and could be seen. Barbara chewed slowly because hunger made speed dangerous. The first swallow burned. The second settled. The third reminded her how empty she had been since yesterday evening. A pair of young ladies in plum cloaks paused beyond the wall, where they could see her shoes beneath her hem. "That must be one of Lady Wycliffe's people," one said. "The plain one." The other gave a soft laugh. "Useful, then." Their carriage moved on. Barbara brushed crumbs from her glove and folded the breadcloth for later. Plain had become her name in a half the city. It carried less insult than truth in their mouths. She was thin from rationed meals, pale from unheated rooms, and too quiet for society to forgive. Yet plain was also convenient for those who wished not to see. A plain woman could hold documents no one feared she could read. A plain woman could stand in a drawing-room and vanish while silk rustled around her. By late afternoon, the sleet had thinned to a hard grey rain. Her fingers were cracked along the knuckles from wet cold, each fold of skin bright and raw. She climbed the rear steps of the house in Queen Square that had once been her father's pride, boots slipping on the stone where moss held water, and entered through the service passage because the front hall was for guests and daughters, and she was accounted as neither. Heat from the kitchen reached only as far as the scullery door. Beyond that point, the corridor returned to winter. Mrs. Wycliffe's laugh drifted down from the drawing-room above, rich and bright, followed by the lighter voices of her two daughters, and then the clean ring of crystal. Barbara set the satchel on the sideboard for inspection. She laid each receipt in order. She counted returned coins into a shallow dish. She waited. The housekeeper, who had known her father and never said his name now, inspected the papers and made a mark in a small book. "One candle charged to attic use last night," she said, without looking up. "Lady Wycliffe has noted excess." Barbara stared at the woman's pen. "I copied numbers after dark. There is no light in that room by day." The housekeeper paused, then shut the book. "The account stands." Up the back staircase then, skirt hem cold against her calves, hand trailing the banister polished by years of servants and children, and now by no one who belonged. The attic room had a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a grate that remained unlit unless Lady Wycliffe entertained relatives and wished to display charity. Tonight no coal had been left. A rim of frost whitened the inside corners of the window where rain met old glass. Barbara unlaced her shoes and peeled her stockings from torn skin, breath held between her teeth at each pull. The heels were rubbed raw and one had split again where yesterday's scab had not held. She washed them in cold water and watched the basin cloud pink, then clear, then pink once more. She had been told often that she was oversensitive to discomfort, that stronger girls managed farms and births and war widows' burdens without complaint. She did not complain. She wrapped her heels in strips cut from an old linen cuff and set the strips with a knot learned from watching surgeons in her father's office years ago, firm enough to hold, loose enough not to numb. The room smelled of damp wool and iron from rain. Her stomach tightened and released in small, hard waves. She had one crust left and chose to save it for morning when the walk began again. When darkness settled fully and the lower floors quieted to distant footsteps and occasional laughter, she drew the trunk key from the seam she had sewn into her petticoat hem. She had stitched the seam herself by candle end over 3 nights. Down in the yard, lot 43 waited under lock, she had paid half to reclaim. Here in the attic, she kept what could be carried in her 2 hands, 3 copied folios, a blunt pencil, and 1 volume from her father's legal shelf, with the spine broken but the statutes intact. Alistair MacDonald had taught her letters by reading case notes aloud, had said that law was only memory with teeth if a person learned where to look. Fever had taken him in 11 days. Debt had taken the rest. Within a year, Mrs. Wycliffe had married into his name and called his trust instruments burdensome old paper. Within another year, the trust for Barbara's portion had become household debt adjustment. In ledgers, Barbara herself was made to carry across town. Worse than theft was theatre. Mrs. Wycliffe brought neighbours to tea and spoke of sacrifice. She spoke of a difficult stepdaughter with no head for sums. She produced childish notes Barbara had signed at 12 for ribbons and school ink, and called them obligations still unpaid. Men nodded. Women sighed. No one asked why interest on a child's note should exceed a servant's annual wage. Barbara set the candle stub in a chipped saucer and lit it from a taper stolen from her own supper years ago and hoarded to this use. The flame trembled, gathered, and steadied. She opened the worn volume to trust law and copied passages in a neat hand that did not match the shaking in her fingers. Trustees must not commingle trust assets with personal debts. Beneficiaries may demand accountings upon reasonable suspicion of misuse. She wrote each line twice, once as the statute stood, and once in plain language she could recite if papers vanished. The words did not warm the room, but they gave shape to rage that would otherwise rot inside her ribs. Outside, coach wheels hissed through wet streets. A drunk man sang half a verse and lost it. Somewhere below, a door closed and bolts slid into place for the night. Barbara bent over the page until her neck ached and her eyes burned from smoke. She copied 1 more clause, then another. Hunger remained. Cold remained. Lady Wycliffe remained below her, in silk and lamplight. Yet, under Barbara's hand, the law held still, exact and indifferent to perfume, and in that narrow attic where each candle inch was counted against her, she guarded the one thing no one had yet managed to auction. She guarded the one thing no one had yet managed to auction, and because she guarded it, memory came for payment at once. The line she had just copied sat black and narrow on the page, but what she saw was her father's hand guiding hers over the same words at a walnut desk that had stood 1 floor below this freezing room, back when the house still smelled of peat smoke and ink instead of lavender water and polished deceit. Alistair MacDonald had not spoken loudly. He had never needed to. Clerks leaned forward when he explained an instrument, and clients who arrived angry left quieter, carrying folded papers and instructions they understood. He had taught Barbara that precision was mercy. If a clause was clean, a widow kept her rent. If an account was clear, a servant kept his wage. Fever undid all of that in 11 days. On the 3rd day, he still corrected dictation from bed. On the 7th, he stopped taking broth. On the 9th, his voice thinned to a rasp, and he asked for the lockbox keys with fingers that shook against the blanket. She remembered the iron smell of heated bricks beside his feet. She remembered the doctor saying rest as if rest were a cure. She remembered his eyes on her, not frightened for himself, only urgent that she repeat the names of documents and where each should be stored. Trust schedule, beneficiary rider, rent roll. She had repeated each one. She had believed memory could hold a house together. After the burial, black crape still hanging on the hall mirror, the order of rooms changed by degrees so small they could be denied if named. The study door remained locked. The silver inkstand vanished. Her father's clerks were dismissed in twos. each man thanked for loyal service and paid less than due. The cook was told to reduce portions because mourning required simplicity. Simplicity meant Barbara's breakfast tray stopped arriving. Simplicity meant the nursery fire was put out first, then the upper hall grate, then the attic coal allotment where she had been moved, for practical reasons. Every alteration wore the face of prudence. Every cruelty arrived in language fit for church. By candle end, she could still hear Lady Wycliffe downstairs receiving callers with patient grief in her voice, saying, "My poor husband would have wished economy," as if economy were not another word for taking what could not be defended aloud. The woman had entered the household months before the fever, as a guest who stayed too long and moved through rooms as if measuring them. She had come in sea-green silk and soft perfume, with 2 daughters near Barbara's age who laughed behind gloved hands and called every object quaint until it was moved into their chambers. Barbara's own mother had been dead for years by then, a Highland woman buried under wet stone near Inverness, and grief had hollowed her father in ways he concealed from everyone except his books. Loneliness made him permissive. Politeness made him blind. By the time he understood the cost, debts had been shifted, signatures had been guided, and servants who objected had found references delayed until they accepted lesser places elsewhere. After his death, the visitor became authority with alarming speed. Letters went out under a new monogram. Tradesmen who had addressed Miss MacDonald as the solicitor's daughter were corrected in the doorway by footmen paid from MacDonald funds, and loyal to whoever signed the bills. Within 1 season, the woman was Lady Wycliffe in every drawing-room that mattered, speaking of stewardship, speaking of burden, speaking of a difficult girl whose melancholy made household harmony arduous. Her daughters did not need direct orders. They learned by watching. The elder chose Barbara's mother's winter shawl from a cedar chest and admired the weave while Barbara stood 3 feet away. The younger lifted a carved box of hair ribbons and said she could make better use of them where people might see. The portraits in the morning room were rearranged. Alistair MacDonald's likeness was moved from centre wall to a side corridor to protect it from smoke. Barbara's own schoolroom copybooks disappeared. Her bedchamber was reassigned to a guest, then to the younger daughter's pianoforte, then to storage. She was moved upward 1 staircase at a time until the attic window became her only view, and the bell pull at her bedside no longer connected to any servant below. At table she stood behind chairs to pour wine she could not taste. When visitors asked whether this quiet young woman was a cousin, Lady Wycliffe smiled with practised sorrow and answered, "A dependent relation, dear thing, with no head for management." The daughters repeated it often enough that neighbours repeated it for them. By winter even, the butcher's apprentice called her Miss Barbara in public and plain Barbara in the yard. Words settled around her like ash. She learned to breathe through them. Debt became the instrument by which affection was replaced with arithmetic. Lady Wycliffe kept ledgers as if they were scripture, each page ruled in narrow columns and balanced to the farthing when counted for her benefit, imprecise when counted for anyone else. Barbara's old notes, written as a child for ribbons, copy ink, and 1 pair of dancing slippers bought before her first assembly, were unfolded and entered as liabilities with accrued interest that no statute permitted and no clerk dared challenge while receiving Wycliffe business. Candle stubs were measured against her. Soap was cut in half and charged by weight. A cracked cup in the attic was entered as breakage under her initials, though she had never touched it. When she bled through 1 stocking heel, a replacement pair appeared in accounts as luxury hosiery at 3 times market price. She had signed once, twice, then no more. Refusal did not alter the numbers. Lady Wycliffe simply wrote "deferred acknowledgement" beside Barbara's name and carried the total forward. The daughters learned the game and added penalties in laughter. If Barbara took tea after noon, the sugar was noted. If she remained in the drawing room while guests tuned instruments, idleness was noted. If she returned late from deliveries delayed by rain, inefficiency was noted. Notes became balances. Balances became threats spoken gently where servants could hear. "Debtor's process is regrettable," Lady Wycliffe would say while sorting correspondence, "yet the law cannot be sentimental." Barbara knew enough law by then to hear the lie in every syllable, but law required proof, and proof required paper, and paper was locked. So she worked within the cage offered to her. She carried account books across Bath in all weather and memorised the spacing of entries, the pressure of pen strokes, the way forged initials sat too heavily on downstrokes and lifted too fast at the end. She copied statutes by night until smoke made her eyes stream. She practised recitation under her breath while climbing service stairs with coal scuttles she was not permitted to fill for her own room. She befriended no one because friendship could be questioned and used. She accepted crumbs from no hand that might later describe her as grateful for charity. When the housekeeper deducted candle use and closed the book with that careful little snap, Barbara felt anger rise clean and sharp, then settle into method. Anger burned hot and vanished. Method endured. Her father had left her no cavalry, no rich aunt, no benefactor waiting behind a legal miracle. He had left her language precise enough to cut through velvet if she lived long enough to use it. Below, laughter thinned as guests departed and wheels ground away over wet stones. A door shut. Another bolt slid. The house entered the long breathing silence that came after midnight, when only servants crossed corridors and even they stepped softly to avoid censure for wasted wakefulness. Barbara bent over the page until the candle reached her knuckles and wax warmed her skin. She copied the final clause and then, because fear made repetition necessary, spoke it under her breath in plain terms she had written for herself. A trustee who steals from trust property steals from a named life, not from an abstraction, and restitution may be sought even after accounts are obscured by years and courtesy. Named life. The words tightened her throat more than hunger had. She was not a line item. She was not deferred acknowledgement. She was Alistair MacDonald's daughter in a house where his name still sat above the door in carved stone no amount of lavender water could erase. She sanded the page, folded it twice, and tucked it with the other copies inside the lining she had stitched into her bodice. Then she knelt by the bed and slid her hand beneath the mattress to the loose board where she kept a blunt pencil and one tiny strip of tartan from her mother's shawl, while her other hand checked the petticoat seam where the trunk key was sewn. The cloth was worn almost white at the fold. She touched it once, only once, and returned it to hiding. Sentiment was a luxury until evidence held. At the threshold a faint scrape sounded, then paper whispered under the door. She stood, crossed the cold boards, and picked up the folded instruction without opening it at first because she knew the hand already. Ornamental loops, hard pressure on the downstroke. The seal smelled faintly of rose. Deliver sealed packet to Mr. Calder on the far side of Pulteney Bridge at first bell. Return directly. No delays, no coach fare. She stared at the line until the letters blurred, then set the note beside the saucer and pinched the candle flame between damp fingers. Darkness settled at once, close and complete, and in that darkness she counted what still belonged to her: 4 copied folios, a memory trained to hold figures without error, a name carved into stone, and the refusal to disappear merely because the city had found it convenient not to see. She stood for several breaths with her fingers resting on the sealed instruction, then set it beneath the blunt pencil, and felt her way back to the bed by touch alone, one palm to the wall, one to the mattress edge, careful not to jar the loose board below. Cold climbed through the ticking into her bones. Rain tapped at the window, then hardened again to sleet against the pane. She did not sleep deeply. She never did when ordered to carry sealed papers across town before dawn. The first bell from St. Michael's reached her thinly through weather and stone, and she rose at once, pulled yesterday's damp stockings over bandaged heels, fastened her bodice, tucked the packet into the inner pocket of her mantle where rain would not break the wax, and went down by the back stair before any maid lit the main hall lamps. The kitchen fire had not yet been laid. The scullery smelled of ash and wet cabbage leaves. She drank a cup of cold water from the pump, swallowed the saved crust in 2 careful bites, and stepped into the street while the sky was still the colour of old pewter. By the time she reached the incline toward Pulteney Bridge, the wind had shifted east and cut through wool, as if the cloth were gauze. Shop shutters rattled. A milk cart fought its way uphill, with wheels slipping at each rut. She kept to the parapet side to avoid spray from passing coaches, and held one gloved hand against the packet under her mantle, not from loyalty to Lady Wycliffe's business, but because lost papers became invented debts by supper. Halfway across, a shout split the weather behind her. Not market noise, not bargaining. A sharp command and the ring of iron on stone, followed by the high animal scream of terrified horses. She turned. A dark travelling carriage had come onto the bridge too fast from the east side, team heads thrown white with foam, harness jerking hard against the trace as the lead horse skidded on sleet. The driver hauled right. The wheels struck the crown. The rear swung. Wood cracked against the parapet with a sound like a gunshot. One wheel lifted. The near door burst from its latch and slammed back into the carriage body. A groom was thrown clear and rolled, then lay still, winded but moving. Barbara did not think. She ran toward the splintered doorframe with her skirts gathering water and grit, dropped to one knee in the slush, and reached into the tilted compartment where a young man in a drenched school coat was pinned awkwardly against the opposite seat, conscious, gasping, his face chalk white from shock rather than blood. "Look at me," she said, voice steady because panic wasted breath. "Can you move your legs?" He nodded once, teeth clenched. Behind him, a tall man in a military greatcoat tried to brace himself with his left arm and failed, jaw hard with contained pain, right hand pressed under his coat at the shoulder as if the joint had seized. His dark hair was wet against his brow. His eyes found her at once, cold and exact, even through rain. "Take him first," he said. One sentence, command and concession together. She wedged her shoulder under the younger man's arm, felt his weight shift, and dragged him clear inch by inch over broken panelling. He hissed and nearly slipped. She tightened her grip and planted both heels against slick stone until he was out, and crouched against the parapet, breathing hard but regular. A teamster rushed up then, swearing under his breath, and grabbed the horses' bridles before they could rear again. Barbara turned back to the carriage. "My lord, give me your arm." "Not your concern." His voice was flat with effort. She reached anyway, caught the sleeve above his wrist, and felt a tremor run through muscles held too rigid. He accepted the leverage without another word, and stepped down to the bridge deck with controlled precision, as if refusing the weather the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. Rain ran from the brim of his hat onto a face carved in hard lines. Someone at the far end of the bridge shouted, "Make way for His Grace!" The title moved through the gathering crowd faster than the wind. Heads lowered. Men who had been eager to stare suddenly found urgent business with harness buckles and reins. Barbara's stomach tightened. The Duke of Ravensmere stood 2 feet from her with sleet on his lashes, and one shoulder held too still. He was taller than rumour allowed, and broader through the chest than any portrait in circulation, his greatcoat cut for military movement rather than ballroom display, the collar dark with water, the cuffs marked where fresh blood from a torn knuckle had seeped and thinned in rain. Storm-coloured eyes took in details with brutal speed. Torn glove seam at her right hand, red cracks across both knuckles, mud at the hem where mending thread had given way, shoes too thin for winter streets, the old bruising at her wrist where a grip had been hard and recent enough to leave colour. She stepped back at once and reached inside her mantle for the packet, checking by instinct that the seal remained unbroken. It did. Relief lasted 1 heartbeat. If she was late, Lady Wycliffe would call it theft. If she remained, she stood in the centre of a public incident with a duke, and no protection. She dipped her head. "Your Grace is upright. I must continue to Mr. Calder." She moved to pass. His hand closed around the air between them, not touching, only barring the path with presence alone. "Stop." The word carried less volume than the bridge noise and more authority than both teams of horses. She froze because years of command had trained her body faster than reason. He looked once at her face, rain-plastered hair, the faint blue at her lips, then at the younger man bent against the parapet, struggling to steady his breathing. "Oh, you are shaking!" She heard the accusation in the statement and the concern beneath it, and trusted neither. "I am cold," she said. "He is not drawing full breath." She stepped around the Duke before he answered, knelt in the slush beside the young man, and unbuttoned the top of his coat with fingers gone clumsy from wet. Up close she saw he was near her own age, perhaps 18, too old for nursery pity, and still called a boy by everyone who outranked him. His pupils were clear, no head wound, breath shallow from impact and fear. "Look at that arch," she told him, pointing through sleet to the far stone curve of the bridge. "In for 4 counts. Hold 2. Out for 6. He tried, failed, tried again. Better on the 3rd attempt. The Duke stood over them, very still, rain striking his shoulders and running in lines down the dark wool. "Lawrence," he said to the young man, voice clipped. "Obey!" The name settled the hierarchy at once. Son, heir. Not a child, but precious in the way only one surviving son could be to a house that had buried too many names. Lawrence obeyed the breathing count, eyes fixed on the arch as commanded. Barbara pulled off her own mantle despite the cold, and folded it behind his back to keep him from the wet stone. As she swung the soaked cloth into place, the inner pocket turned. The sealed packet slid free, skidded once across slick stone, and disappeared beneath the parapet rail in the churn of boots and runoff before she saw it. "No!" The Duke's refusal came instantly. She did not look up. "He will keep warmer upright. You can command me later." For one suspended beat, she expected rebuke sharp enough to strip skin from bone. It did not come. Instead, he crouched with controlled care beside his son, favouring the injured shoulder, and set one gloved hand at Lawrence's nape with a gentleness at odds with his face. "Again," he said. Lawrence breathed. 4, hold, 6. The tremor in his chest eased. A mounted guard finally reached them, breathless and mortified, followed by 2 Ravensmere footmen in travelling livery, and a physician from a nearby apothecary summoned by some quick-thinking coachman. The physician dropped to inspect Lawrence and pronounced what Barbara already knew. Bruising, shock, no immediate break. He turned to the Duke and asked permission to examine the shoulder. The Duke ignored him and looked at Barbara instead. "Your name." She hesitated because names became liabilities in rich men's mouths. Barbara MacDonald. Recognition did not cross his features, but attention sharpened. MacDonald of Queen Square. It was not a question. She nodded once. Rain slipped under her collar and down her spine. The obligation of the sealed packet felt suddenly heavier than lead. At the mention of Queen Square, one of the watching tradesmen snorted softly and muttered to another, loud enough to carry, "Lady Wycliffe's plain one!" Heat rose in Barbara's face, shame and anger braided tight. She reached for her mantle from behind Lawrence's back. The Duke caught the movement and stripped off his greatcoat with his good arm, despite the physician's protest. "Take this." "I cannot." "Take it." The command struck like flint. She accepted because refusing in public would become spectacle. The coat settled around her shoulders, heavy with rain and male warmth beneath it. Too large by half, sleeves past her hands. His scent was wool, wet leather, and clean steel oil, from travel pistols. Her pulse stumbled once, then steadied by force. The physician touched the Duke's sleeve again. "Your Grace, if you do not permit me to set that shoulder now, at the inn." 2 words. Final. He rose without assistance and swayed almost imperceptibly when weight shifted through the injured side. Barbara saw it. So did he. Their eyes met for one bare moment, and the admission in his was not weakness but calculation. Pain measured, compartmentalized, refused. At the bridge entrance, a magistrate's clerk arrived to take statements for property damage and injury record. Paper was produced, names requested. Barbara stepped backward through the crowd, already shaping the apology she would have to offer for delay, already hearing Lady Wycliffe say, "prison," in her soft drawing-room voice. She had taken 2 steps when the Duke spoke again without turning. "Miss MacDonald remains." She stopped, as if a hand had closed at her throat. "Your Grace, I am under instruction to deliver a sealed packet by first business call. I have no right to miss the appointment." "You have just preserved my son from panic and further injury." His gaze cut toward the clerk, then back to her. "You are now a material witness to this incident. You will give statement under my protection." Protection. The word was dangerous in any man, catastrophic in this one. "Lady Wycliffe will not regard that as lawful excuse." "Lady Wycliffe may address me." No rise in voice, no elaboration. The clerk bowed so low his hat nearly touched the slush. Lawrence, colour returning to his face, looked from his father to Barbara and managed, "Please stay until we leave the bridge." The plea from him, quiet and earnest, removed the last practical defence she possessed. She inclined her head. "Very well." She gave the statement in precise sequence. Weather conditions, carriage speed, point of impact, extraction order, condition observed. No embellishment. No trembling in the words, though her hands trembled inside the borrowed sleeves. The clerk sanded the page and asked for signature. She signed as B. MacDonald, then paused as ink spread in the cold. The Duke signed beneath with a hard, swift line that cut through damp fibres. When the clerk withdrew, a footman approached with a recovered object wrapped in oilcloth. "Found near the west rail, miss." Her stomach dropped. The sealed packet. Mud-streaked but intact. Seal bruised, not broken. She took it and nodded thanks she could not afford aloud. Evidence not lost. Accusation blunted, if only slightly. By the time arrangements were made to transfer Lawrence and his father to shelter, the sleet had thickened into hard rain, and the bridge stones shone black as slate. The nearest posting inn stood less than a quarter-mile away, its upper windows already lit against the morning gloom. The physician insisted on immediate treatment for the Duke's shoulder and hand. Lawrence, stubborn and pale, insisted he could walk, but accepted his father's arm after 3 steps. Barbara moved to return the greatcoat. The Duke looked at her bandaged heels visible where wet skirts clung and said, Keep it until fire." She should have refused. She did not. They crossed the bridge together through rain and staring faces, rank and ruin, bound for the same doorway under one weather-beaten roof. The inn-yard swallowed them in noise and steam and wet straw. Stable lads ran for the Ravensmere team. 2 grooms lifted trunks from the tilted carriage with faces set hard against shock. Rain beat on the signboard and rattled the lantern chains. Lawrence took 3 steps under his father's arm, then stopped, breath catching high in his chest again. Barbara moved without permission, took his other side and bore part of his weight through the doorway while the innkeeper bowed to the Duke and stared past her as though she were only another saturated garment to be dealt with by staff. Inside, heat struck first as pain. Her fingers burned. Her cheeks stung where sleet had needled them raw. The private parlour had been opened in haste. A fire had been pulled high, still smoking at the edges. A physician set down his leather case and began issuing instructions to no one in particular, asking for hot water, clean linen, brandy, and quiet in that order. Lawrence lowered into a chair by the hearth, jaw tight. One hand braced on the armrest as if he feared his own lungs might betray him again. The Duke remained standing. He removed his gloves with his good hand. The torn knuckles had stiffened, blood dark where rain had dried it. Barbara reached for the greatcoat at her shoulders. "Your Grace, your coat." "Keep it." His voice was low and final. He turned to the physician before she could answer. "Set the shoulder. Examine my son first." Lawrence lifted his head. "Father, no, you can barely move." "Be still." The physician moved toward Lawrence. Barbara saw at once how the young man's breathing changed under the pressure of 3 men speaking over him. Faster, shallower, shoulders rising with each inhalation. She had seen this once before in her father's chambers, when a clerk had fallen from scaffolding and awoke in panic before any bone was touched. She stepped closer and kept her voice level. "Mr. Lawrence, look at the mantel clock." He looked, startled by the direct address. "Match the second hand. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hole for 2. Out slowly for 6. The physician frowned. "Miss, do not interfere." "She is not interfering." The Duke did not look at either of them when he said it. "Proceed." Lawrence obeyed the count. One breath, then another. The shake in his fingers eased. Barbara kept counting quietly, until his chest settled into the longer rhythm his body could hold. Only then did she step back. The physician examined him, prodded bruised ribs, rotated wrists and elbows, checked pupils, and at last pronounced that rest and warmth would suffice if pain did not worsen by evening. The Duke inclined his head once. "Now my shoulder." He sat because the physician ordered it, and because sitting was the only way to keep the damaged arm from locking entirely. Barbara should have left then. The packet under her mantle seemed to press against her ribs with each beat of her heart. First business call had already passed. Every minute in this room gave Lady Wycliffe another line to weaponize by supper. She turned toward the door. A stable boy rushed in without knocking, hat in both hands, eyes wide. "Beg pardon, your Grace, the coach groom from the bridge. His leg is cut, and he will not let us clean it." The innkeeper swore under his breath and told the boy to fetch a man who knew better than to argue with pain. No one moved quickly enough. Barbara heard herself speak before caution could silence her. "Where is he?" The boy pointed toward the service corridor. She looked to the Duke out of habit she resented. "May I?" His gaze fixed on her face, then dropped once to the packet-shaped edge beneath her borrowed coat, then back to her eyes. He gave a short nod. "Go." She followed the boy through a narrow passage that smelled of spilled ale and damp wool. The groom sat on an upturned feed bin by the back door. Trouser leg dark with water and mud, teeth clenched as another lad hovered uselessly with a basin. The wound itself was a long scrape and a shallow cut where shattered wood had raked his shin, not mortal but filthy and painful enough to make a grown man kick at any hand that came near. Barbara knelt on wet flagstones and set the basin between them. "I am Barbara MacDonald," she said. "I pulled no rank on the bridge, and I will pull none now. If you strike me, I shall still clean this." The groom blinked at her bluntness, then gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if he had less pain. "Do as you please, miss." "I do not. I do what is required. Hold still." She asked for boiled water gone warm, soap and clean cloth. None appeared fast enough, so she washed her own hands first, then used the least dirty linen available and worked carefully from the edges inward, lifting grit one grain at a time. The groom cursed once when she reached the deeper section. She did not rebuke him. She only said, "You may curse, you may not kick." He obeyed. She tore a strip from the hidden hem, facing of her petticoat where no one would see, and bound the leg snugly enough to stem seepage without cutting circulation. When she finished, she pressed 2 fingers to his ankle pulse. "Steady!" From the corridor mouth, unseen by her until she rose, the Duke had been watching in absolute stillness. His injured arm remained close to his body, his other hand white around the head of his cane. Lawrence stood half a pace behind him, wrapped in a blanket, pale but upright. Barbara stood too quickly, and the room tilted once. Hunger and heat and adrenaline fought each other under her ribs. She steadied herself against the doorframe and regretted the motion at once when she saw the Duke's attention sharpen. "You are faint," he said. "I am not." "Liar!" The word was quiet and without cruelty, more observation than accusation. It unsettled her more than anger would have. She faced him squarely. "Your coachman can bear weight with assistance. He must not ride today. If fever comes, reopen and wash again." The Duke held her gaze for one measured breath, then turned to the stable-master, who had finally arrived, red-faced and apologetic. "You heard Miss MacDonald. Follow it exactly." "Yes, Your Grace." Only when orders were in motion did he step aside and leave the passage, Lawrence beside him. Barbara followed more slowly. By the time she reached the parlour again, the physician had set the Duke's shoulder in place, with a hard, efficient pull. Sweat stood along the Duke's temples despite the cold. He made no sound during the reduction, not when the joint shifted, not when the arm was fixed in a sling. Only the tightened line of his jaw and the brief blanching across his mouth betrayed what the body refused to hide. A woman in black wool entered then, carrying herself with the composed authority of someone who had run one household through grief and would run 10 more if required. Grey threaded her dark hair. Her eyes moved once around the room and missed nothing. She went first to Lawrence, checked the drape of the blanket and the colour in his face, then to the Duke, pausing one heartbeat at the sling. No fuss, no tears, only precision. "Mrs. Davies," the Duke said. "Your Grace." She inclined her head. "I came with the second carriage when word reached us at the toll gate." Her gaze shifted to Barbara and rested there, not curious, assessing. "This is Miss MacDonald," the Duke said. She rendered aid on the bridge and again in the yard. Mrs. Davies gave Barbara a small bow suitable for a gentlewoman, not a servant. "Miss MacDonald, you are wet through. You will sit near the fire before you fall." "I thank you, but I must deliver a packet in town and return." The Duke answered without looking at her. "No," she turned to him. "Your Grace, with respect, delay will be used against me." "By whom?" He knew the answer and made her say it anyway. "Lady Wycliffe." The name cooled the room. Mrs. Davis's expression did not change, but some private recognition passed through it. The Duke lifted his head fully then. storm eyes hard as riverstone. You will not go back into this weather on bleeding heels to satisfy a woman who sends you across Bath at dawn without fare. Heat rose at Barbara's throat, not from shame alone. To have her condition named aloud in front of strangers felt like standing without skin. My circumstances are not your concern, Your Grace. Today they are. Lawrence looked between them with a frankness only youth could carry in such a room. She saved me twice. Father, let her at least eat before she leaves. Barbara answered before the Duke could. Your Grace's son owes me nothing. I did what anyone should. The Duke's mouth altered by a fraction, not a smile. Something smaller and rarer gone at once. Anyone did not, he said. By the time the noon bell from the Abbey drifted through rain and shutters, the inn had settled into an uneasy order. Damaged carriage inspected, horses rubbed down, statements copied for the magistrate's file. Barbara sat in the edge chair nearest the fire because Mrs. Davies had placed her there and stood over her until she complied. A tray arrived with broth, bread and tea. Barbara ate the broth because declining would have caused a scene, and because her hands had begun to shake in earnest now that urgency had nowhere immediate to spend itself. She wrapped both palms around the cup and felt life return in painful increments to each finger. Across from her, the Duke stood at the window with his slinged arm and watched rain stripe the glass. Lawrence dozed in a second chair, blanket to his chin, one hand still curled around the pocket watch Barbara had used for counting breaths. The physician had gone downstairs. Mrs. Davies spoke quietly with a footman over travel arrangements, and then dismissed him with instructions crisp enough to cut through panic. Barbara set down her cup and drew the sealed packet from inside the greatcoat. Mud marked one corner. The wax remained intact, though one edge had flattened. She held it out toward the Duke. You asked my name and compelled my statement under your protection. I ask one thing in return. Witness this seal as unbroken at this hour. His eyes moved from the packet to her face. Why? Because Lady Wycliffe will say I tampered with it when she learns I was delayed. A witness of your rank may prevent one lie from thriving. He came to the table, took the packet without opening it, examined the wax, then called to Mrs. Davies. Paper. She placed writing materials before him in silence. He wrote 3 lines in a decisive hand, sanded the ink, folded the page around the packet, and sealed both with his signet. There, he said, statement of condition, time recorded, my seal. Barbara stared at the impression in red wax. Ravensmere's crest, clean and undeniable. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. You have done more than I requested. I did precisely what you requested. She met his gaze. Then I thank you. He inclined his head once, as if thanks were an item to be acknowledged and set aside. Mrs. Davies stepped to the dining sideboard and began laying plates for a private meal. One for the Duke, one for Lawrence, should he wake hungry. She reached for a third, paused, then, without asking, set 2 places at the small table by the fire instead of one. The silver clicked softly against china. The movement was tiny and seismic at once. In that room, in that household orbit, it carried the weight of a declaration no one had spoken. Barbara saw it and felt warning rise through her like cold water. She rose at once. I cannot dine here. Mrs. Davies did not look up. You can stand if you prefer. The soup will cool either way. The Duke watched Barbara over the back of the chair, face unreadable. Rain beat steady at the window. Lawrence slept, breathing evenly at last. Barbara drew the greatcoat tighter around shoulders too thin for its weight, and held herself still until her voice would remain level. I shall eat quickly, then depart to complete my errand. The Duke's answer came in the same clipped register he used for military orders, but the edge had changed. "You will eat, you will warm, then my carriage will take you wherever you must go." She should have argued. She knew the price of accepting favours from powerful men, knew it in her bones, in every lesson bought with humiliation. Yet the packet lay on the table wrapped in his written witness, and a coach groom in the yard sat bandaged because she had chosen him over safety, and Lawrence's breath now rose and fell without panic because she had counted each second aloud. She had acted without bargaining. She had done what was required. For once the world had answered with structure instead of punishment. Barbara sat when Mrs. Davies touched the chair back. She did not see, because she kept her eyes on the table linen, that the Duke remained standing through the first several minutes of that meal, as if still guarding a bridge no one else in the room could see. He remained standing through the first several minutes of the meal, and Barbara felt his stillness more sharply than she felt the heat from the hearth. It had weight. It altered the room. Mrs. Davies ladled clear soup into the bowl before her, set bread within reach, and withdrew without fuss, yet not beyond call. The Duke did not take his own chair. He stood beside the mantel with one hand braced on the carved edge, sling tight across his chest, his gaze fixed on Barbara as if he were measuring whether she would bolt. She lifted the spoon. Her fingers trembled once against the silver. She set the spoon down, then forced herself to lift it again and drink. Salt, parsley, bone broth rich enough to make her stomach clench in pain before it eased. Across from her, Lawrence slept with his head turned toward the fire, lips parted, breath regular. The Duke spoke without raising his voice. "All of it," she looked up. "Your Grace. The soup, the bread, the tea." She held his gaze, then looked down at the bowl. "I am not one of your household to be ordered at table." His expression did not soften. "You are a woman who crossed a bridge in sleet with open wounds in your shoes. You are cold to the bone. You are under my protection in this house. Eat!" The command landed like a door bolt. She should have answered with refusal, with caution, with the old strategy of appearing smaller than she was. Instead, she took another spoonful because weakness had become visible, and visibility had already cost her too much. Mrs. Davies returned with a plate for the Duke, set it untouched at the second place, and poured fresh tea into Barbara's cup before stepping back again. The china clicked once against the saucer. The sound was almost delicate. Barbara drank and felt warmth spread, then sting, then settle. When the Abbey clock marked noon through rain and shuttered glass, the Duke finally moved. He came to the chair opposite her and sat with controlled care, as if each inch of motion had to pass through pain before it reached muscle. He did not begin his own meal. He watched her break bread and dip it into soup, watched her chew, watched her swallow. She had lived years beneath glances meant to diminish. This gaze did not diminish. It stripped pretense and left only fact. "You keep count while you eat," he said. The bread stopped halfway to her mouth. "I beg your pardon." 3 swallows, pause, hand to your side, 3 more. "You're rationing as if someone might remove the plate." Heat rose under her skin, hot and humiliating. She put the bread down with deliberate care. "If your Grace has appointed himself observer of my table manners, he has chosen poor entertainment. I have appointed myself nothing. I notice what is in front of me. So does every person in Bath. Most of them have better manners." A fractional movement touched his mouth, not quite a smile, gone in a breath. "Most of them saw a plain girl on the bridge and looked through her. I saw your hands under my son's ribs, counting him back to breath." Her pulse struck once against her throat. She reached for the cup to steady it. "You owe me thanks. You have given them. That is sufficient. No. The word was quiet. Final. She lifted her chin. No, Your Grace. No, it is not sufficient. He set his uninjured hand flat on the table linen, long fingers spread as if anchoring himself. You asked for one witness to one seal. I gave it. You presume the account is closed. It is not closed. I have watched you since the bridge. You do not ask for help when you need it. You minimize injury as if honesty is a luxury. You defer to men who sneer at you and defy them only when another person is in danger. That pattern ends here. Her breath shortened despite the heat. You speak as though you know me. I know what I have seen. An hour of rain and panic is not knowledge. He held her eyes, storm grey and unwavering. I know enough. The room seemed suddenly narrower. Fire popped in the grate. Rain hissed at the panes. Lawrence shifted in sleep, then settled again. Barbara kept both palms flat against her skirt so he would not see them shake. My life is not yours to regulate, she said. No, it is yours to defend. You have been defending it alone with frayed gloves and copied law in your memory. His gaze dropped once to the packet wrapped in his seal. You should not have had to. She went still. The words copied law cut deeper than accusation. She had not spoken of her night studies. She had shown no page, no folio, no scrap. She heard herself ask, low and careful, How do you know that? He did not blink. You recited trust duty to the clerk at the bridge when he asked for sequence. You corrected his wording without looking at his paper. In the yard while the physician argued with me, you listed liability in exact order to the stable master. Wound, contamination, fever, reopening protocol. You speak statute as if it is muscle memory. Your father was a solicitor. You are his daughter. I did not need a confession. Something in her chest tightened, then opened painfully. To be read accurately felt more dangerous than contempt. Contempt was familiar ground. This was exposure. She forced steadiness into her voice. Observation is not entitlement, Your Grace. Agreed. He leaned back slightly, a movement that drew colour from his face, but not control from his voice. Entitlement is what Lady Wycliffe practices. I do not. The name struck like sleet against bare skin. Barbara pushed back her chair. Then allow me to leave at once and return this packet before she makes theatre from delay. She rose. Pain fired through her heels where wet bandages had stiffened. Her balance shifted. She caught the chair back before she stumbled. The Duke was on his feet in the same instant, faster than his injury should have allowed, the chair scraping hard across floorboards. Sit! I can stand. Sit! The second command carried iron, not anger. Protection sharpened to necessity. Mrs. Davies appeared at the door as if she had been waiting for that tone. Miss MacDonald, she said, calm and unarguable, if you tear those heels open again, the walk will be slower and the pain will be worse. Sit! Let me look. Barbara's pride flared and failed against plain fact. She sat, Mrs. Davies knelt, lifted the hem only as far as propriety allowed, and unfastened one shoe with gentle, efficient hands. The stocking peeled away from damp linen strips, darkened at the edges. Barbara set her jaw. She would not flinch. She would not make a sound. Mrs. Davies clicked her tongue once. Raw, both sides, she murmured. As I expected. The Duke had not resumed his seat. He stood beside the table, shoulders squared, sling stark against black coat, looking not at the wound but at Barbara's face as if the wound were only evidence for the larger injury no one else had named. Fresh linen, he said. Mrs. Davies extended her hand without looking up. Already here. She cleansed the skin with warm water steeped in calendula from the innkeeper's stores, then wrapped each heel in clean strips and tied firm knots that would hold through wet streets. Barbara breathed through her nose and fixed her eyes on the packet to keep from shaking. The Duke did not speak again until both shoes were back in place. "Better?" Mrs. Davies asked. "Yes." "Truth, miss," Barbara swallowed. "Better." "Mrs." Davies rose, wiped her hands, and gave the Duke a brief look that carried years of silent household language. He answered with a slight inclination of his head. She withdrew and closed the door softly behind her. Barbara stared at the grain of the table. "You arranged that as if I were a recalcitrant child." "I arranged it as if you were injured." She looked up sharply. "The distinction matters." "It does." His voice lowered. "That is why I made it." He returned to his chair and sat, slower now, controlled to the point of rigidity. For 3 breaths he said nothing. Then, without flourish, without any softening phrase to blunt the force of it, he spoke the line that altered the ground beneath her feet. "You will not return to Queen Square alone." She held his gaze. "That is not your decision." "It is." "You cannot command my movements beyond this inn." "I can, and I do." The words should have enraged her. They did. They also carried a structure she had not been offered since her father died. A boundary set not to trap, but to shield. She despised herself for hearing the difference and hearing it instantly. "My errand is not optional," she said, "nor is my return. Your errand will be completed under escort in my carriage. Your return will occur under escort in daylight, with witness, and only if you choose to cross that threshold." "I do not have the luxury of choosing." "Then borrow mine." Silence fell between them, thick as wool. Rain pressed the windows. Firelight moved over the planes of his face, catching at the scar near his temple she had not noticed before. His injured hand, the one not in the sling, lay on the tabletop now, and she saw a faint tremor begin at the base of his thumb. Pain, contained and failing containment. He shifted the hand beneath the table at once, as if to hide the evidence, and she knew he expected her to pretend not to have seen. That was what rank required. That was what people gave powerful men. Blindness in exchange for safety. She did not give it. "Your hand is shaking," she said quietly. His eyes lifted to hers. No answer. "It needs rest." Still no answer. She could have retreated then, could have offered courtesy and looked away. Instead, she heard her own voice, stripped of title and etiquette by a concern she had not invited. "Does it hurt?" The question hung between them, bare and intimate as a wound. For several breaths he could not answer. She watched his throat work once, twice, watched him master his face by force and fail to master his eyes, where pain and anger and something older moved like weather over deep water. At last he said, each word measured, "Yes." Nothing ornate, nothing evasive. A single truth given like a concession, wrested from stone. He drew one slow breath. "Sit beside me." The command was softer than the others and far more dangerous. Barbara felt the room tilt again, not from hunger this time. "For what purpose, Your Grace?" "So you will remain seated until the carriage is ready." "That can be accomplished without proximity." "Not with you." She should have refused. She knew she should. She rose anyway, moved around the corner of the table, and took the chair at his right, where his slinged arm would not be jostled. Their sleeves did not touch. The space between them was narrow enough to feel his heat through wool. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the fire. Outside the door, muffled footsteps crossed the corridor. Somewhere below, a groom called for harness checks. In the room, Lawrence slept on, one curl fallen over his brow, No trace now of the ragged breath on the bridge. The Duke did not move, not to adjust the sling, not to reach for his cup, not even when a muscle along his jaw tightened sharply with pain. He sat in absolute stillness beside her, as if motion itself were a risk he refused to take. After a long minute she understood what that stillness cost him, and what it declared without speech. He would endure discomfort rather than create distance. She kept her eyes on the fire and spoke into that charged quiet. "You cannot repair my life with orders." "I know. You cannot undo years in one afternoon." "I know." "Then what is this?" His answer came without pause. "A beginning." The word struck somewhere she had kept barricaded for years. She did not trust it. She did not dismiss it. She sat beside him in the small private parlour, while rain worked at the windows and the fire burned lower, and neither of them moved until Mrs. Davies returned to say the carriage stood ready, 2 outriders in place, and no one in the yard would mistake Miss Barbara MacDonald for anything less than a woman under the Duke of Ravensmere's explicit protection. Barbara rose when Mrs. Davies opened the parlour door, and the Duke rose with her, not because courtesy required it, but because his body had already learned to move when she moved. The corridor smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. Down in the yard 2 outriders sat straight in Ravensmere livery, while a dark carriage stood ready with fresh horses and leather traces checked twice. Mrs. Davies settled the greatcoat around Barbara's shoulders one last time, then folded Barbara's own soaked mantle and placed it in her hands. "This has been dried as far as the fire allowed," she said. "Miss MacDonald, your packet." Barbara took the sealed bundle from the side table, where it had cooled under wax and ink, and the Duke's hand paused a moment over hers, not touching, only confirming by sight that his crest remained unbroken. They reached Mr. Calder's office within the quarter hour, wheels cutting through rainwater along Milsom Street. Calder's clerk opened the door and blanched at the sight of Ravensmere outriders behind a plain woman in a mended dress. Mr. Calder came himself at once, cravat imperfectly tied, and bowed too deeply to the Duke before his gaze slid toward Barbara with practised condescension already forming. It died when the Duke spoke. "Break the seal in front of me. Read every line aloud." Calder's fingers shook as he cut wax. The enclosed letter was Lady Wycliffe's hand, loops and hard downstrokes Barbara knew as she knew her own pulse. The first instruction ordered the filing of immediate debt process against Barbara MacDonald for non-payment on private notes. The second enclosed revised trust entries transferring MacDonald beneficiary funds into household liabilities retroactively. The third line requested destruction of prior draft pages to avoid confusion. Calder stopped reading there, colour draining from his face. "I had not filed it yet, Your Grace," he said quickly. "The weather delayed delivery." "Then weather has done one honest thing today." The Duke turned to Barbara. "Do you wish this entered now with the magistrate?" "Yes." No tremor in the word. She drew one folded copy from her bodice, lining, then another, then the narrow strip where she had written plain language statutes in a hand cramped by cold attic nights. Calder stared as if witnessing sleight of hand. She laid each page in order. "Those are my copies of trust law and account sequence," she said, "and this is the original arithmetic I memorised from Lady Wycliffe's ledgers before alteration. Her entries reverse chronologically after my father's death. Ink weight shifts, signature pressure changes. She counted my childish notes as compounding debt." Calder lowered himself into a chair without meaning to. The Duke's gaze sharpened. "You will attend court and state what you were instructed to file." Calder swallowed. "Yes, Your Grace." By the time the Abbey clock struck 2, the magistrate's chamber was full enough that the ushers had opened the side rail for standing witnesses. The same bridge clerk who had sanded Barbara's accident statement appeared with the register and read his report into record first. Weather conditions, carriage damage, material witness detained under ducal authority, packet seal witnessed intact at the inn and again at Calder's office. That report closed Lady Wycliffe's first path of accusation before she could speak it. Barbara felt the room shift, subtle and real, the social current turning by degrees toward a fact. Lady Wycliffe entered in green silk despite the rain, lavender water announcing her before her voice did. Her daughters followed in plum cloaks, eyes bright with the brittle excitement of scandal they presumed they still controlled. She looked at Barbara once, then at the Duke, and gathered her smile like a weapon. "Your worship, this is a household misunderstanding inflated by masculine dramatics. The girl has always been unstable with sums." Barbara did not flinch. She placed the copied folios before the bench. Calder, called next, read aloud the letter he had received and admitted under oath that prior drafts had been requested for destruction. The magistrate requested the underlying ledgers. Lady Wycliffe produced bound books with gilt edges and false composure. Barbara asked permission to inspect one page. Granted. She pointed to a transfer entry from the year after her father's death. "The stroke here begins with heavy pressure and lifts abruptly," she said. "My father's hand never lifted there. He completed the full curve before tapering." "Mr. Calder can confirm from retained deeds," Calder confirmed. The magistrate asked for further corroboration. Barbara drew from her pocket the auction receipt for lot 43 and the half-payment notation in the clerk's hand, then the trunk key she had cut from her petticoat seam that morning in the carriage. "The trunk sold under debt instruction, as if household property," she said. "It contains trust schedules marked by my father's initials. I request retrieval under court order." Lady Wycliffe's composure cracked at the edges. "Those papers are irrelevant domestic relics." "They are primary instruments," the magistrate said. "You will moderate your language, Lady Wycliffe." One by one, the details Barbara had carried in silence entered record and hardened into law. Candle charges assessed as debt, soap and stocking penalties fabricated, childhood notes converted to compound liabilities, wages withheld from 3 dismissed elder servants whose names Barbara recited from memory. Mrs. Davies, called unexpectedly by the magistrate after the Duke's quiet word to the clerk, produced written references she had obtained for those same servants when they were turned out. The loaded look she had given Barbara at the inn resolved in open testimony. She had recognised MacDonald names from old service rolls and preserved what proof she could, waiting for a forum that would hear it. Lady Wycliffe tried once more. "I managed that household after a devastating death. I made sacrifices no one thanked." The magistrate's reply was flat. "Stewardship is not licence. Fraud wrapped in mourning remains fraud." He pronounced judgment in full chamber. Fraud and coercion proven. Debt claim against Barbara MacDonald void. Immediate seizure of Lady Wycliffe's discretionary accounts, pending restitution. Trust principal to be restored to Barbara, with accrued income recalculated by court auditor. Back wages to the 3 named servants to be paid from seized funds, with references reissued under magistrate's seal. The altered ledgers, Calder letter, bridge report, and Barbara's copies were entered as exhibits and sealed. Lady Wycliffe was removed by court footman when she refused to surrender her keyring. The rustle of green silk on stone sounded smaller going out than coming in. No one laughed. Rain had thinned to a cold mist by the time they reached the Bath coaching yard. The head porter, who had mocked brass and silk, stood silent now, while the clerk brought out lot 43 under court note. Barbara knelt beside the damp leather, hands unsteady only once when she set the key. The lock resisted, then gave. Inside lay her father's folded schedules wrapped in oilcloth, 2 deed bundles, and a small box of blackened wood. She opened the box and found Alistair MacDonald's signet ring nestled in linen, the engraved initials worn smooth at the edges by years of use. She closed her fingers around it until the metal warmed. She turned to the Duke. "The trunk is reclaimed. The receipt can be marked settled." "It already is," he said. Calder paid the remainder under court order from the first seized account. Every physical thread she had carried all day had found a ledger line, a seal, a destination. When they reached Queen Square under escort, Barbara entered by the front door for the first time in years. The magistrate's officer inventoried lockboxes in the drawing room while servants watched from thresholds, frightened and newly attentive. Barbara did not climb to the attic again. She collected only what was hers: legal volume with broken spine, blunt pencil, tartan strip, and the remaining folios from the loose board beneath her mattress. She left the cracked basin and the unlit grate untouched. At the hall table she set down her old room key and walked out without looking back. Night had fully settled when Ravensmere Hall received them, its stone facade lit in long rows of amber windows. Inside, warmth did not feel theatrical. It felt engineered, reliable, quiet. Mrs. Davies met them at the entry and took Barbara's damp mantle, then paused when Barbara extended the Duke's greatcoat. "Thank you," Barbara said. Mrs. Davies accepted it with a nod that held respect rather than pity. In the small dining room, 2 places were already set by the fire. Not a grand table, not display, precision. The Duke dismissed the footman with one glance. Mrs. Davies poured wine, set water, and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Barbara remained standing by her chair. "Your Grace, I require terms before I remain in this house." He stayed standing as well, sling dark against his coat, face pale from a day of controlled pain. "State them." "I will not be kept as dependent ornament. I will not accept charity disguised as kindness. If I stay as legal steward under contract, with authority to audit estate accounts and wages, and with independent control of my restored trust." "You will have it," she held his gaze, "in writing." "By morning." She drew breath, then gave him the final edge of it. "An equality in any personal vow you ask me to make." At that, something in his expression shifted past restraint into clarity. He crossed to her slowly, as if each step had been considered in advance and would not be taken back. He placed the blackened wooden ring box on the table between them and opened it. Her father's signet lay inside, cleaned now, the initials sharp in candlelight. "You will not return to an attic in chains of debt," he said. Then he lifted the ring, set it in her palm, and closed her fingers around it with deliberate care. "Miss Barbara MacDonald, I ask you formally and openly, will you marry me and stand as my equal in law and in this house?" No audience, no theatre, no pressure hidden under gentleness. Just the question, clean as statute. She felt the old hunger for caution rise, then settle before a steadier thing. She was no longer erased in her own name. The law had spoken, the accounts had turned, the trunk was open. The key was no longer sewn into a hem. She looked at the man before her, carved from grief and command, and an unexpected discipline of care, and answered with the same precision he had given her all day. "Yes, I will." He did not reach for triumph. He did not claim her hand like spoils won. He bowed his head once, as if accepting terms in solemn contract, and only then touched his lips to her knuckles, brief and reverent. When they sat, it was at 2 places set before either had spoken, and this time neither place was an accident.